Final Fantasy XVI is a roller coaster. As cliche as it may sound, it's true. It's equally keen on providing incredible, over-the-top set pieces as it is in offering long stretches of snore-inducing content. One moment I'd be on the edge of my seat, and the next I'd be reaching for the recliner button. As a result, I came out the other side of the credits with mixed feelings. The title certainly ends on a high note, but I simply can't take all the hours of boredom and push them to the back of my mind, and so I won't. To provide some context to these thoughts, I'll say this. Final Fantasy XVI is worth playing, but it's one of the rare times where I must recommend beelining the main story and leaving the side content in the dust. Doing so will cut your playtime from 55-ish hours to about 25 or 30, and I think it's absolutely worth making that sacrifice unless you're really enjoying every single character. The side content is often bogged down by long stretches without interactivity, as well as gameplay sequences that are ultimately repetitive fetch quests. Some of these issues rear up in the main questline as well, but it's offset by remarkable, best-in-class action sequences that are an absolute adrenaline rush of an experience. I don't want to show spoilers in this introduction to the video, although they will come eventually, but suffice it to say, some of the sequences in this game will stay with me for years because of the epic scale. Now, I'm a newbie to the series, I've only played 7 Remake, but this does seem like a great jumping in point for the series if you're also new like I was. Alright, so those are my overall thoughts on the game. Now let's get into the nitty gritty with a look at Final Fantasy XVI. Keeping in tradition with the series, Final Fantasy XVI's story is standalone, taking place over 1,000 years ago in the land of Valisthea. Much of what you'll come to learn about this land is done through the main story. This land is made up of 2 continents, Storm and Ash, and it's home to many different warring countries whom all seek control over the most precious resource, crystals. These crystals are the world's source of magic, a tool that can be used to make life easier for the humans. There's 5 massive crystals called Mother Crystals found throughout the land, and each acts as a sort of capital city for the associated country. These huge shinies are the source of all magic, but tiny fragments of the crystal can be taken from them and distributed for everyday use. People call upon the crystals to use magic. However, it comes at the cost of the land. Every time a crystal is used, there's a small consequence for the world. An ugly blackening of the landscape kills off all natural life in its path as a result of overusing the magic. Fortunately and unfortunately, there are humans, known as bearers, whom are able to channel and use magic without the use of a crystal. Despite seeming like they should be superheroes, bearers are often a mark of shame for a family that they're born into. They are often cast away, enslaved, and forced to work grueling jobs until the magic has been completely drained from their bodies. To make matters worse, from calling upon the magic too often, their bodies eventually succumb to a curse similar to petrification. It's not a pretty life for these folks, as they are abused physically and mentally to keep society afloat with the rich on top. Thankfully though, you play as one of these bearers, a man named Clive, who goes on a journey of self-discovery, forgiveness, and more as he seeks to end the plight of these people by destroying the cursed Mother Crystals. This much of the world is conveyed very naturally through the main quest. It may take a bit longer than you'd hope to begin understanding the terminology, but after a while, you come to see the full picture. With that being said, another large portion of the game's story has to do with the political landscape of the warring nations, and to be quite clear, it was difficult to follow along with. First off, naming your continents Storm and Ash is already a bit unclear, as the mind first goes to the noun counterparts. You don't think of these words as locations, but instead as things, and it made things jarring from the jump. From there, you have all these other nations whose names and leaders are just thrown around without a proper introduction or explanation about who they are or what they stand for. As you progress the main story, you'll come to know these leaders, but often generic words like republic, kingdom, empire, and more are used to describe these places, and they often just lead to confusion as you try to understand who the hell the characters are even talking about. You also don't get to spend much time within these civilizations to really understand how they function or what day-to-day life looks like here. So there's no real opportunity to build that understanding and that element of world building. Perhaps worst of all is that the game frequently shows cutscenes of important people from the other lands, but you don't have any context for it. So you see the cutscene and you're just like, great, I don't know who those people are, I don't know what that meant, but okay, cool, that's cool. Other games do a phenomenal job of contextualizing the world without breaking the fourth wall, but Final Fantasy XVI really struggles with that at times, especially in regards to those warring nations. Now, if you're familiar with the channel, you know I love taking some time to talk about the believability of a game's natural landscape, as well as how fun it is to move around and traverse. Final Fantasy XVI is, well, it's alright. There's a handful of maps that you can move through seamlessly, but they aren't interconnected with each other, meaning we don't have a true open world here. It's more open world-like, but even then, it's pretty shallow. There's a few open plots of land that are connected by small, linear, hallway-esque paths, which really make you feel like you're being shuffled from place to place. The size of the continents is also undercut by this design choice, as you can reach one side of the map from the other in just a handful of minutes. Ash is the biggest culprit here, as the entire continent is comprised of only one map. It's like walking across Europe in 15 minutes. It creates some mental dissonance that pulled me out of the experience. To the game's credit though, there is a healthy amount of diversity within the landscape. There's the swamp marsh of Three Reeds, the impressive Velcroy Desert, the blight-infested lands of Waloed, and a handful of impressive capital cities like Sambraque. These, along with smaller villages like Northreach and Lostwing, offer up plenty of diversity without ever feeling like they couldn't coexist so close to one another. So while your ability to traverse these lands and move about them freely is capped, you're at least treated to a nice variation within the landscapes. So overall, I'd say half the world building is good, with the other half being so-so, because of how it was presented. The landscapes are varied, the mother crystals and magic are explained very well, and the plight of the bearers is really hammered home. But the political side of things is left underexplored and therefore weak. When so many other games I've played have done their world building so well, it's noticeable when a game stumbles, and I do feel like that's the case here. Alright, let's have a look at the content that's available here, focusing in on the quest in particular. The main questline here is good. I'll talk more about specifics later in the video, but in terms of its overall structure, I'm reminded of the roller coaster analogy. Each mainline quest is building up to an epic boss fight, with each step towards it representing that slow pull to the top of the hill before careening full speed into an adrenaline rush. There are times though when you feel the slowness of that build-up, as you seem to be going on fetch quests for characters when you just want to do more of those epic fights. For example, this girl named Mid shows up. That's a great name, by the way, Mid, I love that. And you have to retrieve parts for her to build part of her ship, right after fighting a godlike titan in a fight whose scale is paralleled by Kronos in God of War 3. Like, the fight is big, it's massive, it's epic, it's huge, it's incredible really. And then you finish it and she's like, hey, can you go, buy some stuff from Home Depot for me? And it's like, yeah, it's not great. I mean, you go from this to fetch quest. It just doesn't feel great at all. Now, I do think it's smart that they drip feed the excellent boss encounters out as to not make them stale, but I do wish some of the content along the way was elevated to a higher standard. Part of the problem is that you start to identify a pattern as you play, and when a game becomes predictable in its storytelling and gameplay structure, it does lose some of the gusto. You come to realize the 4 different types of main missions. Choose a mother crystal and set out for it, come to a town where you must help one of the town's leaders, reach the crystal and destroy it, and then do a wind down mission for a companion before repeating the process again. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these missions are great, and I did enjoy a good many of them, but the overall structure of them remains very familiar as you play, which would be fine if they could ascend to the quality of the boss fights housed at the Mother Crystal locations consistently. Without clearing that bar, without bringing the rest of the content up to that level, some main missions do feel like a drag. However, that fatigue may have been due to the fact that I completed all of the game's side quests, which were mostly dull, boring, and repetitive. Perhaps by indulging in so much fetch questing and exposition dumps, it made me tolerate it even less in the main story. I'd say about 90% of the side missions feel like filler without a strong gameplay or narrative punch to justify the time investment needed to complete them. There's really 3 issues with side content here. Number 1 would be the long stretches of dialogue with no opportunity to interact with the game. You'll get into these exchanges where Clive and NPCs just drone on in a back and forth for seemingly forever. Take this example where over 11 minutes of cutscenes and dialogue is exchanged before I get to fight a single thing. In a world where TikTok has trained our brains to only pay attention to things for 7 seconds or so before we get something new, asking a player to sit there for 11 minutes without doing anything, yeah, that's a tall order, especially when the characters here aren't particularly memorable, engaging, or interesting. They're not all terrible, don't get me wrong, but I don't think any of them are really that special. It leads to boredom, as I found myself reaching for my phone to check out Twitter, and no, I will not be calling it X. It baffles me though that I haven't seen more complaints about this online. People raised hell about something similar in Horizon Forbidden West, but at least you had a dialogue wheel in that game, where you could choose to ignore or engage with the extended exposition. Here, you can't. You either skip through the dialogue or sit and listen to it. Dialogue options would have been incredibly appreciated here, to at least provide a modicum of interactivity. Without them, I often found myself skipping through dialogue, especially towards the end when I came to see the side quests for what they really were. And that leads to issue number 2, repetitive gameplay. Truly, the only meaningful interaction you have with the game is in combat, and to a much lesser extent, build diversity. Without dialogue options or engaging traversal, that's really it. Now, don't get me wrong, combat is fun, but it's also simple, as we will come to see. So after minutes of idle chit-chat, getting to fight against enemies you've probably seen before, using the same overpowered abilities, it just doesn't feel like a reward, especially when you're fighting because an NPC needs a flower or a person needs rescued. It just feels like a collection of the most generic side quest ideas trotted all throughout the history of games, and they just brought them all out here. They failed to deliver anything new or exciting, while also not challenging us with the gameplay. And finally, issue number 3 with the side quests are the rewards. Often, side quests will reward you with a handful of currency, some crafting items you already have an abundance of, or if you're extremely lucky, an extra potion slot. Oh boy, how exciting. If you're not going to give me cool new weapons or interesting gear to change up my playstyle or a new magic ability, then what's the point? I already have enough garbage in my inventory and more than enough currency. I don't need more. As a result, the question becomes, why am I doing these side quests other than for the sake of full completion? The narrative frame is boring and lacks interactivity, the gameplay is the same as what I can get in main quests, and the rewards just aren't enticing. I found myself sick of the side content by the time I reached the last batch of them, of which there were about a dozen right before the final mission. I did them all, and it was yikes. There was one good one in there with Jill that I really liked. Other than that, yeah, I recommend skipping them, and it pains me to say that because I'm a huge fan of optional content. But here, it didn't click. Now, with that being said, I can recommend the side quests if you fall into the following contingency extremely hard. If you found yourself absolutely adoring this world and its characters, like you absolutely find them fascinating, then yes, doing the side content will be worth your time. Much of the spoken word expands on the problems and people found in Valisthea. Some characters and towns even get entire quest lines, like Blackthorn the Blacksmith or Martha's attempts to save more bearers. Intricate amount of detail is plugged into these exchanges, which will greatly enhance your understanding of the world. It goes a long way towards world building, but it just doesn't involve the player's inputs much, and for me, it ended up being a deal breaker. Finally, there's a handful of other challenges to complete, the most notable of which would be the hunting board. This features 32 different encounters with large, beefed up creatures across the land. There is quite a bit of enemy variety, and so these fights never come off as repetitive. It's also fun to just be out in the world exploring and then you stumble into one of these beasts. It's like one of one total reasons to ever go off the beaten path, because you might find one of these monsters. These are doled out slowly as you complete the story, and so checking back every once in a while to see if there's new hunts is definitely worth doing. I have nothing bad to say about those fights. They took regular enemies and they just jazzed them up a bit. So yeah, I like those. Okay, like I said earlier, combat is really the only meaningful way you interact with the game, and so they really needed to nail this to make it worth playing, and it's my belief that they did do just that. They did it well enough that it's worth playing. Your default kit includes a melee combo, a ranged option, and a dodge button. These are useful tools to do chip damage while you wait for your other abilities to ready themselves for use. In particular, I was impressed with the responsiveness of the dodge button and the timing window to land it, or even a parry if you're good enough. Doing either with precision opens up a temporary moment of weakness where you can secure some extra damage. It felt like they really nailed a sense of flow in this regard. Of course, that state of flow is only achieved after becoming accustomed with the very awkward button layout. R1 is the dodge button? Yeah, that's just bizarre. There's no custom button mapping, but you can switch between two different presets. I found both of them to be awkward for the first 5 hours of the game. Who came up with these? I just don't understand. After some practice though, I did make the adjustment, thank goodness. The only thing that tripped me up throughout the entire game was switching between my dog's attack commands and my healing potions. So sometimes I found myself using an expensive elixir when I simply meant to sick my canine on opponents, and that sucked. Anyway, outside of those basic options, you'll find most of your damage output is going to come from your icon abilities. Icons are these godlike creatures who a few rare humans, called dominates, are able to channel and transform into. There's 8 in the game: Phoenix, Ifrit, Ramu, Garuda, Titan, Bahamut, Shiva, and Odin, and each has a power pertaining to a certain element, such as fire for Phoenix, lightning for Ramu, wind for Garuda, and darkness for Odin. Fortunately for you, you play as Clive, the dominant of Ifrit, a creature capable of absorbing and using the power of all the other dominants. Throughout the course of your journey, you'll pick up these other icon abilities, whether they are volunteered to you by allies or stolen away from villains. It's pretty cool, I really like that concept. In combat, you can equip 3 of these icons at a time with 2 abilities from each one. Abilities can be exchanged and purchased in the menus, but more on that in a bit. While fighting, these abilities function on a cooldown, but a pretty generous one. It's quite easy to overwhelm enemies with a flurry of spammed icon abilities, all of which aim to usually do one of 2 things: straight damage or stagger a foe. I didn't take time to experiment with all of them, but those are the basic rules as I saw them, although it does appear one icon has some defensive capabilities. Large AoE super moves can be used to clear smaller enemies in a hurry, especially when paired up with a combo of melee strikes. And then, when a bigger foe enters the arena, one carrying that yellow posture bar with him, you can unload your heavy staggering moves to knock him down. This is how you will deal with the majority of the bigger enemies in the game, and if you take the time to do the side quests, you may find yourself over-leveled. If this is the case, you can wipe through bosses very easily, as your flurry of icon abilities will keep them stun-locked continuously, ensuring that they rarely get up. Outside of major bosses, I kept many foes under wraps through a combination of heavy staggering and damaging moves, like Bahamut's Giga Flare and Shiva's Diamond Dust. In this way, combat can start to feel a bit repetitive, as you get in that constant groove of just spamming your abilities, waiting for the cooldown, and then doing it again. But I think the animation and feel do enough heavy lifting that the monotony doesn't set in completely. What I'm getting at here is that the biggest weakness of Final Fantasy XVI's combat lies in its difficulty. Unless you are imposing limitations on yourself, which to me is never a valid excuse for dodging criticism, you will very rarely die on your first playthrough. That's because Square Enix made the baffling decision to lock away the harder difficulty until New Game Plus. This sparked a debate online about the difficulty within the game. People were complaining that gamers would support Elden Ring's lack of difficulty options because that was the developer's vision, but at the same time they wouldn't support Final Fantasy XVI's lack of difficulty options because the game was just too easy. And that argument just seems so silly to me. From Software is a company known for developing challenging titles that never offer a difficulty slider. So yes, that's a part of their vision and is the intended experience. Final Fantasy XVI does offer difficulty options from the start, meaning difficulty wasn't necessarily a core part of their vision, but they still restrict the player from challenging themselves as much as possible until New Game Plus. That is what makes no sense to me. Why lock away hard mode but offer up easy, and normal of course, from the jump? It baffles me. This, along with the weird button layouts and passive side quests, were 3 of the 4 biggest head scratchers for me with this title. As for me personally, I didn't mind the game being on the easier side, but I do think there's many gamers who want to be challenged more, and forcing them to wait until New Game Plus to do so is just silly. Okay, so that's sort of an overall summary of combat. Melee action with a strong emphasis on cooldown abilities to damage and stagger foes without a whole lot of pushback or challenge. Now, let's briefly talk about the icon fights, because these are most likely the moments that will stay with you the longest, because truly, I haven't experienced anything like them with this scope and scale while delivering such a high quality of presentation and performance ever. I mean, look at this. This stuff is crazy. Explosions everywhere, massive bosses, lengthy encounters. It's just something that you have to play for yourself to fully appreciate how epic it is. It's just a sensation that pours over you as you play, and it's unlike anything I've experienced before. They play out when Clive finally comes face to face with the Mother Crystal he's been targeting for destruction, and it's usually being guarded by another Dominant. After words are shared, a fight breaks out. Sometimes it's human versus human, sometimes it's icon versus human, and other times it's icon versus icon. And most of the time, you'll shuffle through these 3 encounters within one. It's great. When Clive primes, he transforms into a Freet, a second Dominant of Fire whose moveset is pretty similar to his human counterpart. There's a melee combo, a ranged attack, and eventually a dodge, block, and super ability are unlocked. Again, explaining the mechanics of how it works is like telling you what it feels like to drive a Lamborghini. It's something you have to experience for yourself to truly appreciate, because Square Enix has gone above and beyond to deliver a series of memorable encounters when face to face with other Dominants. The graphics, stakes, animations, scope, and music are able to lift these encounters into legendary status. Your PlayStation 5 might end up gasping for air with how much it's putting out on the screen at one time. Mine didn't have any issues, but there have been reports of people's PlayStations overheating and shutting off while playing this game, so do be mindful of that. So, combat in Final Fantasy XVI is not ultra deep by any stretch, but it's a solid base set of mechanics that relies on other components to elevate itself, and that's by no means a deal breaker. I never got tired of the power fantasy, but it will leave some players commenting on its repetitive nature and lack of difficulty. So far, I've mentioned some real problems, but I think the most disappointing element for longtime fans of the series is going to be the very weak RPG mechanics. It's something that's been mentioned since the game's earliest reviews, but it's worth rehashing here because of the series' history. Again, I'm not an expert on this franchise by any stretch, but what is offered here for role-playing feels extremely bare bones. When I think of an RPG of this sort, I'm picturing a fully customizable party where you can select not only who's in the party, but also what gear, weapons, and abilities they have equipped. And of course, that also includes the main playable character. There should at least be some different options for building them how you want. But here, no. Let's start with Clive. Since we're going to be playing as a predefined character with his own history and personality, you wouldn't expect dialogue options that change who he is or what he stands for. So missing those here seems alright. Although dialogue options would still be appropriate when talking to NPCs to get further context on the world or its people. But yeah, I can forgive that. But on the gameplay side of things, you won't have much control over Clive's build either. He has a weapon slot, 2 armor slots, and 3 accessory slots. This is not a game about loot. Instead, improving your weapon often boils down to visiting Sharon and buying one with a higher attack stat and maybe improving it at Blackthorn's shop. By checking in with these 2 NPCs frequently, you'll always be stocked up on the best weapon you can currently have. Money is almost never an issue, so weapon choice boils down to buy the one with the biggest numbers and then do it again later. The same is often true of the 2 armor slots. Just turn your brain off, buy the big numbers one, and move on. It's weak and offers the player almost no choice in what weapon they want to wield. Then of course, you have those 3 accessories, which I hardly ever noticed playing a role, and so I hardly shook them up to try new things. That's because most of them are just generic buffs to health, defense, or improving cooldowns for your icon abilities. I didn't see one accessory that made me go, oh, that would really switch up my playstyle. I think that's a real shame they didn't include it. Now, the icon abilities provide a little more flexibility. As I mentioned earlier, you can have 3 equipped at a time with 2 abilities from each for a total of 6. Each icon has 4 or 5 abilities that you can purchase, upgrade, and master in the skill tree. By mastering an ability, you can equip it to a different icon, meaning you aren't forced to stay color-coded. For example, I liked being able to stagger enemies once I depleted half their endurance bar, and so Garuda's Deadly Embrace ability was necessary. That's what enabled me to do that move. By pressing the circle button after a sound cue, Clive would grapple the enemy, tear them down, and allow me to get some free hits to further push towards a full stagger break. However, I wasn't super fond of Garuda's Wicked Wheel ability, as I believed it could be replaced with something for a bit more damage. So I bought Diamond Dust from Shiva, upgraded and mastered it, and then slapped it onto Garuda. I didn't have to surrender Deadly Embrace just to get Diamond Dust, and that was great. I liked being able to mix and match. However, ability points weren't handed out as plentifully as currency was, and so it felt disincentivized to purchase a new ability that you wouldn't be sure you'd absolutely love. That was a real bummer, but there's enough options that you can settle into something you like. But the complaints don't stop there. Perhaps my most used ability in the entire game was the Scarlet Cyclone available from the fire icon. Relatively early in the game, I wondered what might happen if I equipped it into all 6 available slots. In my mind, I'd be able to spam it 6 times in a row, which seemed awesome. I even equipped an accessory that increased its damage. I felt like I was genuinely building something that I wanted. But then I went to test it and realized that they all function on the same cooldown, meaning I couldn't spam it. If I used it once, all my abilities were drained, and that was frustrating. Now, I can see why this limitation was put into place to an extent, because of how powerful some of the abilities end up being, but it just felt like the game was robbing me of my only chance to imprint myself onto the experience, and that sucked. So there's very little in the way of building a unique playstyle or character, and this carries over when looking at your party members. You will never ever get the option on adding or removing people from the current party. Whoever accompanies you is determined by the path the story is on. So forget sacrificing a mage for another knight, or trying to customize Jill, Gav, Joshua, or Sid to your liking. The only party member you have any control over is Torgal, your wolf companion who can be commanded to heal you marginally or attack an enemy, and that's it. It's severely disappointing, especially after I was brought into the series playing 7 Remake, where you could switch between party members at any time. It added a new dimension to combat that is severely lacking here. Combat feels great because of how flashy it is, but having some additional input would have went a long way. Ultimately, it feels like 16 is one of those RPG light games, you know, an action-adventure that throws in a skill tree or two to make that title applicable. It fits loosely, which is sometimes alright for other games, but in a series as ubiquitous with RPGs as Final Fantasy is, this offering feels extremely meager. With the quality of the gameplay, questing, and world design being inconsistent at best, it only makes sense that the narrative would follow suit. Despite how much time the title spends in fleshing out its world and some of its characters, the majority of the tale being told here is primarily plot-driven. Really, you can split the game up into 2 parts, Clive's journey of self-actualization and the political thriller that comes after that. To be clear, the first part of this duet is the better of the halves. Through a myriad of cutscenes, we come to see Clive's upbringing, how he failed to be born as the Phoenix's dominant, and instead, the ability went to his younger brother, Joshua. Because of his royal lineage, Clive couldn't fade into obscurity, and so he devoted his life to becoming a shield, a protector of sorts, for his younger brother. On the night of his brother's induction ceremony, or whatever this was supposed to be, an attack is led against Clive, his family, and the entire kingdom of Rosaria by a neighboring nation's army. In the fray, Joshua is seemingly killed by a second dominant of fire after he transformed into the Phoenix. Rosaria is left broken, and it's revealed Clive and Joshua's mother betrayed the kingdom and led the attack. From here, Clive begins a decade-and-a-half-long journey to find his brother's killer and enact revenge. However, along the way, Clive meets up with some old friends, including an old love named Jill, as well as a new face in Sid. Sid the Outlaw belongs to no nation, and makes it clear his quest is one of destruction. He's one of the few visionaries who sees how the Mother Crystals are sapping the world of its energy, leading to the blight that ravages the natural land. Sid helps push Clive down the path he needs to go, and it eventually leads to Clive coming to a startling realization. The demon that battled his brother, the Phoenix, was actually himself. As a result of this overwhelming guilt about his brother's demise at his own hands, Clive goes into a spiral, but is eventually able to face himself and accept the truth. This portion of the game takes up roughly the first third and is extremely compelling. Clive is a likable character, and it's easy to relate to the themes surrounding this part of his life: revenge, acceptance, and forgiveness, amongst others. He's so down on his luck during this part of the game, but you can still cheer him on, hoping he can find what he's looking for, and then, when he finds that self-actualization, it's really rewarding. There's really some touching moments throughout, especially as he comes to terms with the past and accepts it for what it is. By the way, press L3 and R3 to accept the truth is the new, more positive antithesis of press F to pay respects. Anyway, shortly after this, Clive begins to buy into Sid's teachings and vows to help him destroy the Mother Crystals and help his fellow bearers escape enslavement. This leads them to decimating Sombreck's crystal in a stunning display, but it also leads to the death of Sid, who, by the way, is easily the game's most memorable character for me personally. From here, we jump forward 5 years. Clive adopts the mantle of Sid. Quite literally, everyone starts calling him Sid, which is weird. Like, really weird. He pretty much becomes Sid. He adopts those ideas that Sid had and goes on the missions for him pretty much. He's the new leader. He's the new Sid. So I guess I get it, but it's just strange. He's focused on destroying the 4 remaining Mother Crystals, and this is where the game dives more into the political thriller, showing us cutscenes with characters we don't fully know yet, explaining the motivations of nations we haven't even visited, and more. At the same time, the game attempts to expand on the relationship between Clive and Jill, but it ends up feeling underdeveloped. And then, at one point, Joshua, who the player knows survived, is reunited with Clive, and the moment sort of feels underwhelming emotionally, considering Clive thought his brother was dead and felt guilty about that for years. The emotion of it is undercut by another epic boss fight, as well as resolving the plot thread involving their mother's betrayal. And yeah, it's just a lot of muddiness during this part of the story. The game seems unable to pick a lane and stay in it, constantly trying to develop the world further, introduce the conflicting nations, build towards the final boss, while expanding on the relationships that Clive has in his life. It's just muddy, and it left me feeling like we were jumping all over the place. Not even some well done emotional scenes could overcome the jarring sensation I was feeling. The first 10 to 15 hours, as we learned more about Clive and his internal struggle, felt impactful because they only focused on that one element. As soon as they began to expand into other territories, it just felt like everything was being shuffled together. Can you follow along with it? Certainly, for the most part. But will you get much emotional impact from it? For me, not really. Just not enough focus in the writing. To me, the game doesn't really get back on track until the final few hours. With all the warring nations seemingly quieted after Clive takes out their Mother Crystals, there's only one obstacle left. Throughout the game, we're shown that a god named Ultima has been meddling in the affairs of each king's nation, quietly pushing and pulling the rulers in directions that ultimately prove to be their undoing. We come to learn that Ultima's end goal is to reclaim Valisthea for himself and the other gods, but to do so, he needs to inhabit Clive's body because Clive is Ifrit. Ifrit is the one dominant capable of using the magic of all the other dominants. If Clive were to lose his free will and be reclaimed by the gods who created him, Ultima's vision for the world would come to pass. That means the loss of free will and humanity as a whole, which obviously Clive stands against. So, just like many other JRPGs, the final struggle is against a deity who seeks control over humanity and the world they inhabit. Despite the pain that can come from free will, Clive and companions know that there is no joy without suffering, no victory without sacrifice, and no freedom without free will. And so they fight on righteously and stand against Ultima, refusing to yield to his vision for the world. It's pretty cliche, honestly, nothing you haven't seen before. However, it's still done in a good way. The voice acting, the writing, the presentation, and the animations all come together once more to elevate this portion of the storytelling. So while everything in the middle feels sort of misguided or unfocused, the beginning and ending are quite well done, and I enjoyed those portions. There's even an ambiguous ending that leaves room for potential DLC if they want to go down that route. Ultimately, the narrative told here was alright. Certainly not one of the best I've ever experienced, but certainly passable. Thematically, it jumps all over the place, exploring societal level problems like limited resources and war, but it also takes time to touch on topics geared towards humanity, such as free will, overcoming guilt, self-actualization, and the importance of leaning on others for help. For me, trying to jam in so many themes while also trying to build up character dynamics resulted in nothing feeling particularly impactful. I see people ranting and raving about how Jill and Clive's relationship is the best the series has ever portrayed romance. And I'm just like, wow, is it also the first time they tried? Because despite some nice scenes, the consistency just isn't there to make it feel important or impactful to the story being told. At least for me. But yeah, story-wise, I don't think it's one that's gonna stick in my head for the long run, but it also wasn't terrible. When it comes to presentation and performance, Final Fantasy XVI is keen on providing a grab bag, good experiences that rival some of the best visual sequences seen on a PlayStation, and also a collection of some uninspired and drab looks. First and foremost, this is the best soundtrack I've heard in any game so far this year. Well, except for Persona 4 Golden, which I'm also playing for the first time. That's besides the point though. The soundtrack here is epic. It complements fights so well that it's absurd. An absolute masterclass put on by Masayoshi Soken here. That battle theme in particular was so good, I even listened to it at the gym. But that ferocity heard in the combat music is matched only by the subtle calmness of a piano as a touching scene plays out. In other words, you get the best of both worlds, leading to a fantastic OST. Oh, and then the voice acting was also pretty good. I mean, not a slam dunk, but certainly acceptable, pretty good I'd even say. In moments of high emotion, I did feel like Clive's voice actor was a little off on the delivery, but his usual gruff sounding voice was stellar. I've been waiting for a character to talk like Geralt for 8 years now, and Clive feels like the closest, so bravo, I love that. Now, in terms of other solid inclusions, we have the performance. I don't think I ever saw this game drop frames once, and I don't recall a single instance of noticeable pop-in. I never had much stuttering, crashes, bugs, or anything that really detracted from the game's performance. I played on performance mode, so that's what I'd expect, but we don't always get that, now do we? I'm looking at you, Jedi Survivor. I've played enough buggy games at release over the last few years, and I just wanted to take a moment to be thankful for a game releasing in a polished and functional state, especially with Starfield looming. Yeah, have concerns about that one. Anyway, you've already heard me mention it by now, but the quality of the animations and particle effects is another component worth praising. The movements, at least in combat, are very fluid, and despite the heavy amount of light particles and moving pieces, I hardly ever felt that I took damage because the enemy's movement was obstructed by them. It happened a few times, but I'll take it if it means fights that look and function at this level. But for as good as the combat animations are, it's crazy how stiff the characters can appear in cutscenes, and how sometimes the lip syncing looks to be a little on the weaker side. Now, in terms of overall visuals, this is where things start to become a bit more drab. The game is equally content blasting your retinas with a bright and inviting color palette as it is in showing you dull greens, browns, and gray colors. This, along with some less than stellar texture work, leads to some pretty uninteresting locations at times. Meanwhile, the lighting is often very flat, and in many darker environments, such as caves, it can be difficult to see. But as previously mentioned, there's also times where the lighting looked absolutely mesmerizing, so it's a shame they couldn't hit that standard consistently. I also didn't play the game on the higher resolution mode, so that could be a factor too. Am I being too harsh on this game's looks? I don't think so, but I often find myself comparing the visuals of games to the visuals of Horizon, and that might not be fair since that game is so far above and beyond the competition. As I've been writing about this game, I've also been doing a lot of thinking about Game of the Year. Yes, I know it's still summer. More specifically, I've been thinking about how games endure in our memory. I look back at all the titles I've played this year, and while some are certainly more complete than Final Fantasy XVI, I still feel like my time with this one trumped those, and I think that's a testament to how strong the strengths here are, whether they be fleeting cutscenes or heart-pounding gameplay sequences. Those icon fights are unlike anything I've experienced in a game before, and as I get older, that's what I want. New experiences. In a copycat industry so stuck on regurgitating the same safe tropes, it's just nice to play something that feels new and exciting. It's a shame though that Final Fantasy XVI isn't able to capitalize on that excitement through its duration, as instead, the best moments are only about an hour each in a game that took me 55 hours to complete fully. Between lackluster side content, repetitive combat, the lack of dialogue options, the muddled and sometimes confusing story, and more, the game just screams inconsistency to me. It's one of those titles that felt like it was on the precipice of something special, particularly within its strong, heartfelt opening hours, but it just isn't able to maintain that momentum throughout, unfortunately. I feel rather torn about my time spent here, but all I can do is be honest with you guys. There were sequences I really enjoyed, but there were plenty of times when I was just straight bored out of my mind. And that's about it. Hell, I don't even have a clever way of wrapping up this video. So instead, I just want to know what you guys thought about Final Fantasy XVI, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and check out some of my other videos. I've covered a bunch of bigger releases so far this year, and there's only more to come. Up next will most likely be a short look at Diablo 4, and then it's on to Starfield in September. Can't believe that one's already upon us, it's crazy. I'm also torn about Armored Core 6. It's a From Software game, so I'm tempted, but I'm not familiar with the series at all. Time will tell on that one. Anyway, thank you so much for watching the video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, join our Discord, the link is below, and as always guys, have a nice day, and take care.